I see so many familiar faces, and those who have taken classes with me know what a fangirl I am of tonight's speaker. Amani Willett is one of my favorite photographers, and having this experience with him this evening is extra special because I now sort of feel like I sort of know him. So it's a thrill to have him here. I know many of you, I've shared his work with many people in the room. So Amani is a Brooklyn-based and Boston-based photographer. He lived in Brooklyn. He now is living full-time in the Boston area, whose practice is driven by conceptual ideas surrounding family, history, memory, and the social environment. Working primarily with the book form, his 2 monographs have been published to widespread critical acclaim. Both books, Disquiet, published by Damiani, and The Disappearance of Joseph Plummer, published by Overlaps, were selected by Photo Eye as best books of the year and have been highlighted in over 50 publications. He now just launched his new book, Parallel Road, also published by Overlaps, and I'm excited that he's going to share some of that this evening. Amani completed an MFA in photography, video, and related media from the School of Visual Arts in 2012 and a BA from Wesleyan University in 1997. His photographs are featured in the books Bystander, A History of Street Photography, and Street Photography Now. His work has also been published in places including American Photography, Newsweek, Harper's, the Huffington Post, New York Times Magazine, and the New York Review of Books. His work resides in collections in the Tate Modern, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Sir Elton John Photography Collection, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, Oxford University, and Harvard University, amongst others. He has a long list of editorial clients on his website, and in addition to his artistic practice, Amani is an assistant professor of photography at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design in Boston. So happy to have you here and welcome you, Amani. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Aline, for that wonderful introduction, and to the Los Angeles Center of Photography for having me tonight. I really appreciate everyone coming out. I'm just going to get set up and share my screen. And then we will. So again, thank you very much. I wanted to just take a moment to, just acknowledge the sort of sad, horrific daily experience here in our country, in DC, and I'm sure we're all dealing with that and processing that in various ways. So just thought I would take a moment to mention that. It's certainly something I'm thinking about today. So because we are here at an educational institution, I've arranged this talk to focus on my specific thinking around my artistic decisions and constructions of my projects. This picture you see on the screen here is probably what I consider one of the most important images I'll show you this evening. And it's this picture of me in the late 70s with my parents in Cambridge, Mass. I'm starting with this picture because no matter how different they might seem, they all start from very personal places. I was raised in Cambridge, the child of an interracial marriage. And being interracial has greatly shaped who I am. My life experience on the whole, I describe as culturally and racially ambiguous, and I've grown to feel very comfortable in this ambiguity. It's something that I readily embrace. And growing up, people always wanted to be able to label me or put me in a box, but I rejected that idea. And as you'll see going through my projects, I think you'll also see that they don't neatly fit into one category or another either. But it took me a long time to understand how central this idea was and is to my worldview as an artist. I think one of art's greatest gifts is to teach us about ourselves and to help us make sense of the world. I think that's one of the main reasons we're probably all here tonight. And in our current situation, being it the last 4 years or the last 12 months or the last 24 hours, I think it's made us all the more conscious of this fact. Years ago, I remember interviewing the photographer Todd Heido. He spoke about how it was his time he spent in therapy that enabled him to understand what he was doing photographically. So my first encounter with photography was way back in 1997 when I was just finishing college. I was an African-American studies and psychology major and I just finished up my thesis and was about to be done with school. A few days after turning in my thesis paper, I was down at the school bookstore and came across this book by Eli Reed by happenstance called Black in America. I picked up the book and I sat down and spent the next hour just totally mesmerized. What floored me about the book was that it was using pictures to talk about the same ideas I had just been writing about for the last year intensively. And this discovery came at a really important moment for me because I was really tired of writing. And here was this other amazing alternative way to communicate that just fell into my lap. So it was great timing, especially since I had no clue what I was going to do when I left college. But it gave me some direction, and I ended up moving to New York and getting an internship at Magnum Photos, where I worked for a number of years. So from my time at Magnum, it got me pretty interested in working on the street, looking at the street photographers there, like Richard Calver, Alex Webb, Henri Cartier-Bresson, just to name a few. And so I, too, was living in New York and, thought I'd set on and mold myself in this tradition. And that's, at Magnum is where I got my real education in photography. And so, using a Leica and shooting Kodachrome seemed like the way to go. And I spent years on the streets of New York making pictures in that vein and just exploring what could be contained within the frame, different ways of using subject matter and light and color. And it was really fruitful for a long time. And I really enjoyed the exploration and the not knowing of, leaving the house and not knowing what I was going to encounter. And also thinking about images that had sort of open-ended narratives, images that offered questions but no real answers. I'm showing a few of these so you can have an understanding of my early beginnings. And so for me, street photography provided a great way to explore different sorts of photographic possibilities, but there came a point where it left me wanting. I wanted the images to add up to something more. I knew I needed to push myself further or I'd lose interest in photographing completely. I was looking for a way to take my intuitive way of making pictures and to mold the images into something more substantial. So the first significant body of work I'm going to share tonight is also my first book called This Quiet. This Quiet started in 2010 with the birth of my first son, Satchel, who is now 10 years old. And so it goes without saying that during this period immediately following his birth, a lot of my thoughts and time was spent with my family and thinking about family. And as a result, I was unconsciously making a lot of images that explored these themes of family and generations and life cycles. But that was only part of the story. In 2010, the world that Satchel was born into was one that I found troubling. There was a severely depressed economy, political dysfunction, wars, climate change, and disasters. It all sounds pretty familiar, and so I guess not nearly as horrific as the last 4 years have been. But at the time, they were very real concerns. And so I was concerned about the state of the country and the world that I was starting a family in. And because of this experience of becoming a father, I found that all of a sudden I was more aware of how external forces could impact my family's life and my life and my feelings about the world. And I became engaged in an internal dialogue where my personal experiences of family were weaving, merging, and converging with my thoughts on the world I was bringing my son into. And it all began to create this sense of unease or disquiet for me, and I wanted to create a project that reflected these feelings. However, it wasn't until the fall of 2011 that the project really came into clear focus. At the time, the Occupy Wall Street movement formed, and by October, it was in full swing. I started going down to Zuccotti Park in Manhattan, in lower Manhattan, to check out what was happening. And at first, I wasn't really there to make pictures. I was there mainly just out of curiosity and a possible interest in getting more involved in the movement. But on one of the visits, I had one of these, moments of clarity where I realized I wanted to try to find a way to create a project where images of my family were in a dialogue with what was happening socially, culturally, and politically in our country at that moment. But even from the outset, I knew that I didn't want to create a project that was overtly generalistic. I wanted my images to move beyond the surface to become more of an experience. My hope was that the images or the sequence of images would convey a feeling rather than simply being literally descriptive. So it was within the book form that I was able to create a structure in which the complex threads of subject matter I was interested in could be woven together. And so, it's easy to show a finished body of work, but as I think we all know, getting to the finish line is often a very messy process with lots of failures. And, photography, I've learned for me, is often mostly about failures. But, just to give you an example, when I originally started working on this project, I was not thinking about it as a book at all. I began by putting images on the wall in a very traditional way, but it wasn't working. And then when I did have this idea to think about, well, maybe this could be a book, it felt like this incredibly radical idea, which now feels quite obvious. But even my first attempts to put the images in book form also failed. At first, I had the idea that there would be 4 chapters, that one would be about my family, one would be about Wall Street, one would be about sad baseball players representing America. And I can't even remember what the 4th chapter was going to be at the moment, but it simply didn't work. But when I did finally find the right form for the book, everything really just clicked. And in terms of my progression as an artist, thinking about my pictures as pieces of fragmented narratives was crucial. When making the book, I found it wasn't about creating a book to house photographs. It was more about using my photographs to tell a story. So throughout the book, there are manipulated images from Occupy Wall Street, portraits of people in my family, and I'll just stop for a moment here and say a lot of my images, just my aesthetic, I shoot a lot of fairly dark imagery, so I apologize if things, I don't know how they look on your screen, but they are naturally dark and they might be even darker on your screen, so I apologize for that. And images also of made in the world while just wandering around during this time. And when combined, these images really did sort of create or represent the uneasiness I was feeling. And when the book was published a few years later, I was very lucky to have Marvin Heiferman write an introduction for the book. He's a curator and writer. And in the intro, he wrote, "Photographs, it turns out, don't always offer up smooth surfaces and lucid narratives. As their dramatic and beautiful images and disquietly repeatedly reveal, photographs can throw up steep speed bumps. Photographs create drag. Instead of enabling you to point to this or to this or to that, a photograph can make you anxious. Photographs can, quite unexpectedly, grab hold of and destabilize you, cause your intellectual or emotional footing to get shaky and take you to places you'd never intended to go." And I think that really encapsulated what I was aiming for. And he said it better than I could. So one of the most important aspects of my work now, my working process, is sequencing. I find it to be just as important as actually making the photographs. Because when you shoot really intuitively, like I do, it's where you can give a body of work its meaning. It's where you can really insert control. While making this quiet, I found that once the images were made, I wasn't concerned about them being tied to their original relationship to the world. I saw them as pieces of a broader descriptive language that I was free to use in whatever way I wanted. This new outlook was incredibly liberating and has become central to the way I think about photographs, that their meaning is malleable and that in the hand of their maker, their meaning can change and they become fluid. So for example, having this image here of an Occupy Wall Street protest with the fire at night, followed by a fire red sky, in this image here, was a way to link the black and white images to the more lush, rich color images which dominate the book. Or this image that comes later in the book segues back into a picture of home, the sequence allowing me to have the smoke from the outside world trail into this image of my wife in the kitchen, creating a relationship between the two. I also became much more aware of birth, death, and life cycles, as I mentioned, during this time. And my grandmother died while I was making the book. And in the sequence, this picture of her dying here in our last few days on this earth is followed by an image of the birth of my son. I was and also am very interested in the formal aspects of picture making to tell a story, the idea that photography itself is its own language. So in Disquiet, I used a warm, dark, rich color palette for most of the book as a way to link the images in a color story, such as shown in this next sequence. This orange-red glow here, to the fire, to this image of a lone police officer down on Wall Street, and this image of my wife's hand. And I also thought a lot about gesture and how gesture could be used to move images along in a sequence. This image here of my wife's hand is followed by this next image of her reaching out and her hand reaching out to touch our son's satchel. And through the use of lighting, Cheerios scattered across the floor could look something like evidence or, evidence of something troubling or even sinister as opposed to being banal. A lot of the pictures in Disquiet were taken at night or in the dark or in bed. And this wasn't a conscious choice, but as the project revealed itself, I realized that it was an important part of its internal logic. I found that in photography, areas of darkness, the areas of darkness and blackness that defy description can be just as meaningful and important as areas of detailed description. So these black and white images of Occupy Wall Street that we've seen have a slightly different sensibility than the other images in the book. It was really important to me that these images feel at once connected and yet distinct from the other images that I was making for the project, to reinforce this idea of my experience versus sort of the world, and sort of cutting back and forth in between the two. Sort of, and I was thinking about cinema as well in this vein, because in cinema we see a lot of cutting between scenes, right? And that's what I was thinking about, sort of cutting back and forth between scenes. And it's not something that you see done as much in photography. We usually think about smooth transitions and not these harsh cutaways. So for example, this image comes just after this next image of my son, juxtaposing but connecting the two. And it creates an unexpected relationship between these images. And I think the wonderful thing that I found that was really exciting to me about the photo book form was that by the simple act of placing two images next to one another, you have created a dialogue between them. So sometimes more obvious connections made sense, but at other times it's really interesting to see how the mind works and struggles to find connections between images that don't at first seem related. Here's an image of Obama seen through a shop window, and it's really the only image in the book that is a concrete indication of when the story takes place. It's also one of a handful of more literal images which act to anchor the themes of the book for the viewer. Another one of these more literal images, an American flag, an abandoned storefront down near Wall Street. Here an Occupy Wall Street protester. And in contrast to the few prior images, less topical images, such as these next few that I'll show you, I feel like open up the project. They make the work less overtly political and harder to label as being, one specific thing. This is my late dog, Jinx. She died this summer. She lived till 17, so sad to see it. I haven't looked at this picture in a while. It's sad to see her here. But through the use of light and color, these pictures have a direct connection to the other images in the book. So while I made a lot of images down in Lower Manhattan and the Wall Street area for this book, they had a very different treatment than I had originally intended. They didn't represent this sort of what the black and white images ended up being used to represent more of this outside force. And with these last two images I'm going to show you from this project, I'll leave you with a quote from Minor White that really helped guide me while making this work. He said, "Sequences of images can exist in order for man to confront himself and will be meaningful in some way to each man alone. Each meaning is right and each meaning is valid." And I love the idea of planting seeds of a narrative or story, but then leaving room for the viewer to come to their own conclusions. And hopefully each viewer will have a slightly different reading of the work based on their own life experience. And this is where my mindset was when I was starting to think about my next project. And because I had so much fun making this quiet as a book, I was really thinking about books in the book form when I started really seriously tackling my next project, which was The Disappearance of Joseph Plummer, which also started with family connections. The story begins with my father. This is a picture of him in the late 1970s. It was around that time he bought land in central New Hampshire. He was looking for a place for peace and quiet in the wilderness. He designed a house and built it himself on weekends, bringing up volunteers from Boston when possible. We'd go up and spend summers and weeks and weeks at a time camping in the woods. So this land became a really important part of our family story from a very early age. The land he bought was also on a lake called Hermit Lake, a small lake that had very few people around it at the time. But it wasn't until around 2013 or so that I began to wonder why the lake was called Hermit Lake and why the road we had been driving down my whole life to get there was called Hermit Woods Road. I began to do some research to find out, and what I discovered was that there was in fact a man who lived secluded in the woods for his whole adult life named Joseph Plummer. And as you can see, his story still resonates today with the names of roads, a lake, and also local businesses like this one pictured here. His story and legend are solidified in the local lore. And what interested me about his story was why it still resonates. I think there are two main reasons. The first is that throughout history, people have been fascinated with the idea of escaping their life to find a more simple existence. It's something a lot of us, I think, have fantasized about at some point, although I think at this point, maybe we're all quite sick of being in our own little bubbles and would value time with others. But second, and I think more interestingly, because very little is actually known about Joseph Plummer, it has allowed his legend to swell. This lack of information actually creates the opportunity for more narrative possibilities. We want to fill in the gaps of a bare bones story, and the only way to do that is to make up the rest. And in many ways, photography is quite similar. It can be argued that photographs are not really good at narrative at all. They're not continuous like film, and they provide very little context. But at the same time, I feel like this is why I believe in photography's tremendous narrative potential. When information is presented in fragments, it encourages an active imagination. I wanted to approach the story of Joseph Plummer in a way that forefronted this idea. In doing research to learn about Joseph Plummer, I discovered that my father had bought land in the same area that the hermit used to live. It was truly remarkable, and it connected me and my family to the hermit's story in a way that I hadn't anticipated. Both Joseph and my father had picked the same area to find peace and solitude in the woods. Here is a picture of the deed that my parents have from buying the land, where it outlines that they bought Plummer Shores. And when researching Joseph's life, I was able to find a few articles about him, as well as some firsthand accounts from residents of the area. And paradoxically, the longer he lived in the woods, the more his legend seemed to grow. I found newspaper clippings all the way from Washington State. But besides these few accounts, there was little else that was known about him. So when I Googled Joseph Plummer, I found a lot of people named Joseph Plummer, but no depictions of the man I was looking for. And this makes a lot of sense. Because his life essentially predated photography. Bookended on the one side by the Revolutionary War in 1775, and on the other by the Civil War in the 1860s. He left society to live in the woods when he was 20, and that was when he was, and that was about 1790 or so. And so, photography hadn't really been invented yet when he ventured off into the woods. So there aren't any pictures of the Joseph I was looking to know more about. And so basically I set out to tell the story of an unknowable man. The book opens with a sequence of 3 images of a mysterious figure fading into the woods. And I see this sequence as an invitation to the viewer to follow the figure, to go ahead and get lost with him. And during the project, I happened to find a book of old poems by John Greenleaf Whittier. And one day while I was looking at the book, I began to see other narratives hidden within the pages. And it made me think about what secrets the landscape around me might be holding about Joseph Plummer. Like the pictures in the book, the text engages the idea of concealing and revealing, but also how the meaning of an image or writing can be given new meaning with intervention. This here says, "Wonder where an old man had a path." I also became interested in how small pieces of text could be used like kernels of ideas, just gently hinting at, suggesting ways for the viewer to engage with images. These texts steer the viewer towards certain ideas, but don't ultimately paint a complete picture. But once a viewer has read a quote, it becomes impossible for that not to influence how they read or understand the surrounding images. It says, "For various reasons, we remember those who have departed this life, some for wisdom or its lack, some for acts of bravery, and for many other things. Joseph Plummer is remembered because he wished to be alone." One of the first images in the book is of a view Joseph would have had from looking out from the land where he lived. To locate the viewer, I included a map of the area, but I've erased the names of the towns so that you don't know exactly where you are. But I've left the map locations for Hermit Lake and Hermit Brook Road. Here's an image of Hermit Lake at night. And I hadn't intended to, but I began to photograph my father and his belongings, his cabin, his tools, his wood pile, his figure in the woods, and insert them into the story. And so ultimately this project became about looking at both Joseph and my dad's desire to disappear and fade into the woods. Now I was really intrigued about this idea of merging their shared experiences with the same land across centuries. Here's a picture of my father's knife. My father carrying a small pile of wood. Axe marks on my dad's wood pile. And so on this project, I also worked with the local historical society. They generously let me borrow and photograph all the historical items and images from their town archive, as well as artifacts they had recovered from Joseph's life that had been donated to the historical society. So I would gather material I wanted to work on over a few short trips to New Hampshire every year. But then I'd spend the rest of the year working on those images, editing, sequencing, and playing with their physical form. Here are a few of the hermit's actual possessions. I photographed these items in a way that highlighted their evidentiary nature. This here on the left is his decision box. He had white and black beans, as the story goes. He would shake up the box and roll out a bean. Depending on the color, that's how he would make his decision about whatever it was he was unsure of what to do. Here is a tin box, supposedly recovered from the site of his house. And here's a historical image where I physically intervened. Working with the archive of images I had access to has led me to an unexpected excitement about working with and intervening on physical images, either by using existing images to create new ones or by somehow breathing new life into old ones. And this is where I think, photography and as artists, it's often the things that come by chance that are, most exciting and most fruitful, the things that we aren't expecting. I found it quite frustrating. I found it quite frustrating on this project where I didn't have access to the thing I was photographing, or I didn't have access to my project physically for most of the year. As I mentioned, I went on a few short trips to New Hampshire. So I had to find ways the rest of the year to stay engaged with the project and to keep working on it. And so that's why I started playing around with the images that I had taken from the Historical Society. And when I found the location of Joseph's home, I made this image. I then reworked the image and hand sewed the photograph to indicate the location of his cabin. And finding Joseph's home and burial place was actually quite difficult. In fact, the first 3 times I went looking, I got lost. I made lots of images on those walks and then used them to create composites to illustrate my experience of searching for his cabin. This also got me thinking about ways to show that there is a person and a story hidden and shrouded in these woods, and I started making collages like this one. To give you an example of how I think about putting images together, there's a short sequence in the book where I see the original hermit's spirit fading and being reborn as my father. It starts with this image here of the cosmos. The next spread is the first time in the book where contemporary images and historical images appear in the same spread, which I see as a merging or combining of the 2 characters' stories. In the following spread, my father seems to be literally setting Joseph on fire and metaphorically erasing his presence. This might be too dark to see on your screen, but out of that fire comes a bear walking out of the woods into the evening or into the night, signaling his eternal presence that I have to say I honestly do feel, while I'm walking through this landscape. And from there, a place is created where there are two existences and two characters. This collage here is the last image in the book and brings the story back to winter, the same way the book starts, and signals that the story might repeat over and over with new characters in new periods of time. Maybe I'm next, maybe my sons, and whoever buys and inhabits or takes the land after we're gone. I thought I'd end this portion of the talk here before I move on to the next project by sharing this quote that I came across by Philip Prodger, who was the head of photographs at the National Portrait Gallery at the time. He said, "Narratives no longer have to be complete to be meaningful. Photographic storytelling is more about networks, nodes, and webs than it is about concise statements. In this world, relationships between images become central. Viewers and artists alike are constantly constructing realities from images, wiring and rewiring like neural networks." And I love this quote. I think he's spot on, and that especially the way the way we relate to images has fundamentally changed in the past decade or so with the internet and social media. And I think our understanding of imagery has gotten a lot more complex and a lot more sophisticated. Here are a few images from the physical book so you can see how some of these elements come together in the physical form, with these poems being treated slightly differently and chipped in. Okay, and so the last project I'm going to discuss is my newest project called A Parallel Road, which came out about a month ago now. And this book engages race in the American roads over the past 85 years. My research and picture making for this project started back in 2010 when I was working on a long-term project on Underground Railroad sites. I spent years researching and photographing locations that factored significantly into the history of the Underground Railroad, but that were not memorialized in any significant way. While working on this project, I was talking to a cousin who excitedly told me about this guide she had just discovered and doing some research for her graduate work called The Green Book. And this was back in 2010, and not many people had heard of this guidebook back then. I think a lot of people know about it now. But for those who don't know, the Green Book was an annual guidebook for African-American road trippers. The guide was published by Victor Green between 1936 and 1966, during the era of Jim Crow laws, when open and often legally prescribed discrimination against African-Americans was widespread in our country. And so right away, I was really interested in the possibility of adding the Green Book to my Underground Railroad project because it felt like a natural extension to the work I was already making. So I approached photographing this project the same way I was photographing Underground Railroad sites at the beginning, which meant traveling to locations that appeared in the book to see how they had either been memorialized, changed, or ignored. But on these trips, I realized that I was much more interested in the psychological trauma and the systemic ways that mobility has been limited for Black Americans, rather than the actual destinations laid out in the book. And this was in part because as I furthered my research, it became apparent that the need for the Green Book is just as important today as it was 85 years ago when the book was first published. We live in a country where the road historically and currently has proven to be lethal to Black people. This is an ad for an app I found, which I think is now defunct, called Driving While Black. And it just goes to show that there's still this need for people to find safe ways to be out on the roads. But this idea runs counter to the American idea of the road trip that has long dominated our view through artistic and literary media and pop culture. For generations, the road has been a symbol of American freedom, exploration, and exuberance. If you simply type road trip into Google, it returns hundreds and hundreds of images just like these here. In fact, within the history of photography, the road trip itself can be seen as a whole genre of photographic practice. In David Campany's book, The Open Road, a large survey book of the American road published a few years ago by Aperture, Campany wonders, is America imaginable without the road trip and everything the road trip implies? The cars, the buses, the motels, the hotels, campsites, diners, and gas stations. But starkly missing from this survey from Aperture are any Black photographers. And in fact, of the 18 photographers featured in the book, only 2 are women. That doesn't discount, that some of my favorite photographs in the world are featured in this book, but it's not a complete picture for sure. When I think of the road, it's always evoked very different connotations than some of these more mainstream associations that we've seen in the previous slides. What immediately comes to mind for me is the civil rights movement and the road as a politically contested space where people have fought for generations for equal rights. It also conjures images of more violent and horrific aspects of the underbelly of American society as a site of racial violence and fear. Or if we look at images of lynchings, they could be seen as early roadside attractions. So that's where was thinking of that's where the impetus was for this project. And so over the past decade, I've spoken at length with family and friends about how scary the road can feel and about how they have often thought of twice before simply getting in their cars and driving. And these conversations put me on a path to explore what I saw as a large hole in the narrative of this quintessential American experience. That shrouded behind the allure of the road is an unsettling and often ignored history of racial strife that persists to this day. So A Parallel Road uses the Green Book as an anchor. The book is the exact same size as the original Green Book. And as you will see in some of the following spreads, The Parallel Road explores the history of the Black experience of the road by inserting historical and contemporary images into the 1940 edition of the Green Book, creating a conversation between the past and current impact of systemic racism on many of our citizens. The book begins with collages of archival images of Black motorists. And all of these images are actually family members. I have a very large and supportive family, and I asked everyone to open their archives and send me images of our relatives and any pictures they could find with people in cars. I got hundreds and hundreds of pictures and curated the images for the book from there. So while the book is meant to speak to the larger systemic mechanisms of oppression, most of the archival and current images and the current portraits are of family members. Their images and words and experiences are really what guided my creative process. These opening images show Black Americans were equally excited to take to the road to pursue the freedom and adventure the road purported to offer all Americans. And off they go. This image is actually of my mom and 3 of her aunts, and it's set against the backdrop of a 1940s edition of the Green Book. My mom is the youngest one there. I'm not sure if you can see her on the bottom right hand. Very excited to head off on a trip. But in the next spread, as they set off on the road, the reality of what awaits starts to set in with this image of a dark road at night. And as the book progresses, the narrative begins to become more ominous. Here, a potential accident on the right and a sign on the left warning Blacks not to be seen in town once the sun goes down. There are towns all across America called sundown towns where Blacks were forbidden to be after dark. If they were seen after dark, they faced intimidation and violence, like pictured in these next few images. Here are the images of the Rodney King beating in 1991, which was caught on videotape. And I was in high school at the time, and this was a very significant, I could sense that this was, a really big deal, even back then. it was before the ubiquity of smartphones. And so it was not commonplace for these acts to be caught on tape or in pictures. We had heard about and knew about injustices, but for it to be caught so brazenly and so graphically was, I think a real shock and a real eye opener. And it was the beginning of an era where we can now often see the injustices that historically have been perpetrated outside of the camera's eye. Here, an unarmed Black man, Ryan Twyman, at the moment that he was shot to death in 2019 by 2 Los Angeles police officers. This image was shared widely on social media. And increasingly, social media has played a pivotal role in the dissemination of information and images of systemic violence and racism. Social media has been quite important in exposing how pervasive racial violence, profiling, and brutality continue to be in American society. Here's a contemporary portrait of a woman in her car. This is actually my mother. Not the little girl in the previous picture, but now an older woman. Another tragedy that was shared widely on social media and was in fact broadcast live in part was the killing of Philando Castillo. This is a recreation of some of the crime scene photos from that tragedy. Another contemporary portrait of a woman in her car at night. Very subtly, in a number of places in the book, police transcripts of violent encounters have been included. Here on the right, you may be able to just make out the segment of the transcript. It's from Diane Reynolds, Philando Castillo's girlfriend, speaking to the police after they shot him. It's in the middle on the right, and it says, "You shot 4 bullets, sir. He was just getting his license and registration." Images of a Freedom Riders bus that was attacked in Alabama in 1961. The passengers on the bus were activists fighting for civil rights. Another contemporary image of a victim of racial profiling and police harassment. On the left, an image of the KKK, and on the right, the Unite the Right rally, violence in Charlottesville in 2017, where a white supremacist rammed his car into a group of anti-racism protesters. Image of Sandra Bland. Here, a man looking out into what I perceive as an abyss of potential fear. Clenched hands on a steering wheel. Here, a woman pulling a handgun on a Black woman in an altercation in a parking lot in 2020, so just last year. But despite the history of violence we have seen here, Black Americans keep getting in their cars and taking trips, refusing to give in to the history of violence and oppression that is meant to limit their ability to live in the same America that has been attainable for many white Americans. And so, like many of our cultural symbols and collective history that has left out minority perspectives, my hope with this project is that it can help begin a dialogue around a more complex and inclusive history of an important American experience. And that's it. Thank you so much for looking and listening. I really appreciate being able to share the work with you.
Thank you, Amani. That was wonderful. I hope people are putting questions in the chat. Couple things struck me while you were talking. I just did a road trip to the Grand Canyon, and having already read your book And it made me look at the road completely differently. And one thing in LA is that many Black drivers have tinted windows. And I never really put it together. But that is, I mean, that could be the reason, is that they're not comfortable driving, especially in Los Angeles. I might be wrong.
Well, you
But
bring up, I think, a really interesting point, which is, you know, and a lot of the research I did that talk a lot about the traffic stop and the idea of automobiles as really being the point. And you know, if you think about the interstate system that was developed and the automobile in the 30s and 40s, all of a sudden you had people interacting in public in a way between races and sharing the same roads in a way that hadn't really been done in the same in that and to such a large extent before that time. And the strange thing about a car is that it is a private space, but it's being used in a very public arena. So I think your question, your comment is a good one, you know, and it's sort of a negotiation of those two very, you know, sort of opposite things, you know, a private and public space, but you know, happening at the same time.
right. So I also was thinking that, you know, a lot of your work is about family, and that Disquiet was really your story. Joseph Plummer was your father's story, and The Parallel Road is your mother's story. And I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but that just dawned on me as you were telling, you know, talking about your work. Um, have you considered that idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting observation. I hadn't thought about it in quite those terms, and I think that makes a lot of sense. You know, I think that I do feel like they're all my stories, but they're right. But I've taken, in certain instances, what, you know, certain different parents have shared with me, you know, and what I've gotten from each of them. So yeah, that's a wonderful observation. And I do think about, you know, I did dedicate Joseph Plummer to my dad, and I think, dedicate this book to my mom. So there, you know, there is that that element to it.
When I first discovered your work was really the Disquiet work. And I'm so glad you mentioned cinema, because I felt like that series was so cinematographic. I'm not saying it right. Like that, you know, pink sky. And there were just like markers that felt like this is a movie, but it's an internal and external movie. And I feel like all your work has this internal and external dialogue, because when you have a baby and you're looking at this precious child, you're like thinking about the baby, but then you're also watching TV and you're seeing these horrific events in the world going on. And you're like, you have this duality of like emotion that goes up and down. And I just felt like that series really, really captured that so beautifully. And I could relate so much to that work.
Yeah, you know, if I could speak that for a minute, I think that was, you know, I touched on it for a minute, but that was such an important part of, there was such an important discovery in that project for me, where I mentioned, I think I was down on Wall Street and I was making images, and I was planning on using all images that I made for the book, but it just wasn't working the way I wanted it to. It didn't feel like there was this, it was missing some sort of dynamic that I really wanted the pictures to have. And I think that the problem was that because they were all mine, it really felt like they were coming from my perspective. You know, even when I was looking at life outside my family, it still really just felt like me looking. And I wanted the images to have the feeling like they were coming from somewhere else. And by mixing the different kinds of imagery together, I just found that it really exploded the narrative possibilities. And it was really exciting to see how storytelling and documentary photography even can be, I think, pushed by using lots of different types of media.
Yeah. You talk a lot about research, and especially with Joseph Plummer, how do you go about beginning to research, and maybe even with Parallel Road, and then finding artifacts and getting someone to lend you the artifacts to work with? And I'd love to hear a little bit about that process.
Yeah, it was a different experience for me because Disquiet was the first project where I felt like I really had created a statement that I was, and I'd finished, and I had, seen it through from the beginning to the end, and kind of had an idea of what I wanted out of the next venture. And so I came at it from a more conceptual place right away. Whereas with Disquiet, I didn't really know what I was doing while I was doing it for a lot of the time, And then it was a recognition, 2/3 of the way through the project that I said, oh, this is what's going on. This is what I'm doing. This is where I want to take it. Whereas I kind of had an idea of what I thought what the project was going to be with Joseph Plummer, and so it made sense to sort of start by doing some investigation. But the trick, I think, for me has been to try to figure out how to, even if I have more of an idea of a conceptual framework for a project, how to keep that the intuitive way I like to make pictures alive, and not have it get too bogged down in being overly conceptual. But with that project, it was really easy to do research because actually one of the ways that I first heard the story was that it was from one of our friends in the area who talked about Joseph Plummer, and she took us and she had heard about his house, and we looked, she said, oh, I think I can find it. The foundation of his old house, and we couldn't, but we spent a day looking, and I just got so fascinated by this idea. And a lot of people in the area just had these just foggy recollections or little pieces of information about this story, and then going to a little small historical in central New Hampshire, it was not, it's a pretty easy thing to walk. They were happy to have anyone walk into the museum that day, and so taking interest in their collection. So they were more than happy to help me, and were very generous to let me photograph. But I didn't actually take anything out. So everything that I photographed, I brought in lights and I photographed it in their space there at the Historical Society. And then with the images, I just used my DSLR and made pictures of all the archival images that I found interesting that they had. So I did everything there on site. But it was wonderful to have all of their resources and to get all the information they had, which again was not much, but it was something.
And I'm just you're getting a lot of questions, so I'm gonna cut this off between you and me after this one. But I so related to how you said you only made a few trips up there, because I shoot in the summers at a lake, and I live in LA and it's in Massachusetts, and so I can't get back to make work. And sometimes having these narrow parameters, you see your work differently, and different ways of creating a story and changing up the work. So yeah. I can really, really relate to that. And I just think really Joseph Plummer is one of the most brilliant books I have come across. And I have to say that it is sold out, but he has a cabin edition through Overlaps. I don't know, that might be sold out too.
I think that's sold out too, yeah.
So yeah, I guess just look on eBay if you're interested. Okay, let's get to some questions here. Wait there. Okay. Yvette asked, were the photos placed geographically to correspond with the location of where it was taken? And that's in the green book.
Right. Yeah.
Parallel road, I should say.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Sorry, was it Yvette?
Yvette.
So originally I was sort of being very didactic in that way, but it didn't work in the final way that I wanted to create the arc of the narrative in that book. So some are, but certainly not all of them.
So I forgot one question that I want to ask you. Amani approaches all his work as they're going to be books. And so when you had, for instance, the big show at the Griffin of Joseph Plummer, how did you make the decisions of what images would be larger, or how to tell that story in a whole new way with the images on the wall rather than in the book?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And, I think with This Quiet, I certainly hadn't thought about that as much. And when I had shown that work, it's been more of like, I'm not sure if people have seen the way Philip Lorker, the court just shows a storybook life, just all small images on a shelf, sort of that surround you. But when I started making the images for the disappearance of Joseph Plummer, I was sort of thinking about how they would look at different scales, even within the book, and playing around a lot more with scale. And so the book was sort of a small canvas or a small gallery wall in a sense, right? But even in that book, there are dynamics. There's things at various sizes, and they have various volumes, right, at different sizes that help the images connect in certain ways. Or some things, you put it there and you're like, oh, that's too loud. That can't be that loud. I've got to make it smaller. Or that's too quiet there. It needs to be bigger. So I kind of had an idea of which images would work better at different sizes already. And so I actually found it wasn't as hard to transform it from the book to the gallery wall as I thought it might be, because I had already been thinking about playing with scale. And so I knew that once I put it on a wall, it was going to have follow some of those same rules, right? About, certainly everything was not going to be the same size.
Yeah, and I loved how you use vinyl, you used unframed work, you used framed work, and so it was a really, really interesting way to exhibit work. So, okay, back to the questions. This is from Bonnie. Wonderful projects. Thank you for presenting them. For the first book, Disquiet, were you making images while you were figuring out the presentation? You mentioned on the wall, which didn't work, and then the book emerged. Were you thinking about the threads of the narrative as you made the image, or had you completed some of the strands, Occupy Wall Street or Your Family, before you started putting the book together?
Well, thank you for that question. And it's a really great question. And so, yeah, as with that project, I was making a lot of images really intuitively. I was making images of my family just because that's what I was interested in at that moment. I was going to Occupy Wall Street rallies because that's what I was interested in at that moment. I wasn't really thinking about them being a project at first. But then once I did kind of have that feeling that, oh, this could be a really interesting way to approach how I've been feeling, and is there a way to merge these different kinds of images together? Then I did start laying things out, and by laying things out, I started to see what I was missing, and I then would make lists of things I wanted to try to add to to different sequences and to different narratives. So I would say 2/3 of it was complete really before I had any idea it was going to be a project. And um, and then the last third was more planned out. And then, you know, one of the, you mentioned books, just to go back to your comment earlier, one of the reasons I think in books now is because it just helps me kind of keep track of everything. You know, I think I would just be too lost. And so it's sort of like a trick, you know. And so even if I think, you know, even if I end up making another project that's not a book, I think I'll pretend it's a book, at least, you know, as a way to keep me focused and a way to keep me on track.
Yeah.
I just found that that's been a really good, you know, tactic for me. And I think, you know, we all just have to learn how we work, right? And what, you know, so I work in fits and starts too. You know, I'm not necessarily good at being like, every day I'm going to make 2 pictures. You know, some people are good at that or need that sort of discipline. So part of what we're all doing, I think, is just continually figuring out, you know, what makes us our best creative selves. Yeah.
Okay. Gail asks, Amani, thank you. You are guided by your desire to tell a story and the influence of cinema, and you're also an intuitive artist. Once you have an idea for a project, how much is taking pictures intuitively, or how much is it a shot list for your project? How do you balance those two somewhat competing goals or proclivities? And how important is writing to your visual work?
Yeah, great question. I'm glad you brought up writing. I'll answer that part in a minute. So yeah, no, it's definitely a mix, you know, of intuitive and also having a list of sort of, you know, a wish list of things, but nothing I stick to too specifically. Or even if I have a list of a kind of image I want, I don't necessarily map it out or know what that end result of that kind of image is going to be. You know, I'm not sure if that makes sense. You know, I might say, okay, you know, in Joseph Plummer, there's that image where I I light an image on fire and I took a picture of it. And I just thought, oh, it'd be fun to play around with lighting an image on fire to see what, you know, what that does. I feel like that, you know, metaphorically, it could be an interesting idea. I was doing it on my Brooklyn balcony almost, you know, my balcony on fire. Luckily, I had a little uh, fire extinguisher out there with me. My wife made me bring it out there. Of course, I wouldn't have thought of that myself. But you know, even in that moment, you know, knowing that I wanted to light an image on fire, but not knowing what it was really going to get, you know, so I'm always really interested in chance, even, you know, playing a big part in what I'm doing, because I mean, photography really is this beautiful thing, and you know, I think digital in some ways can shoot digitally mainly now, but you know, it can suck the soul out of the images sometimes, right? If we overplan things too much, or it can just, I think, stifle our creativity in some ways. So I always just try to find ways to bring in chance back into what I'm doing. And with regards to writing, yeah, I'm a professor too. So, you know, I'm always talking about writing with my students. And I have to admit, when I first started making pictures, you know, I was, you know, I said, well, why do I, you know, I shouldn't have to write. I'm a photographer. You know, I was quite contemptuous of it. You know, why should I have to explain myself? That's what the pictures are for. But the truth is, without writing, I don't think we ever really can grasp what it is that we're doing fully. And by writing, it helps clarify things in a way that then it's like walking. It's like you write something and it sparks something, and then you take a step, and then you make some pictures, and then you take another step, and they reinforce each other. And whether or not you share that writing with anyone ever is up to you, and it might not be important to. And it might be something that's in the background, but I think it is pretty important to have that self-reflection and to kind of have an understanding of what you're doing, even if the end result is to then kind of throw it away, right? But I think you need to have that understanding at some point in the process. Um,
Okay. Erica asks, such thought-provoking ways of thinking of photographic narratives and relating the personal to the public. Can you speak to some of your thoughts during organizing these projects, like organizing on a timeline in the order of how it was shot, or more random like color? Is there such a freeing, this is such a freeing way of thinking about mixing images.
yeah, that's a great question. And like I mentioned it, you know, the sequencing is the editing and the sequencing is just as important to me as the image making. And I have to say at this point, in some ways, almost more fun sometimes um, than the actually making the images. And you know, so it's an intuitive thing, though. It's, you know, it's often by color, it's often by gesture, it's often by content. You know, really just any. I try everything. You know, any possible way that things could be put together. You know, if you know, if my InDesign files for my projects get so large that they crash my computer quite often. You know, honestly, for Joseph Plummer, I think I have about a file with like 1,400 pages or 1,500 pages. Sort of, you know, so I'm just trying all different sorts of combinations, all different sorts of sequences and moving things around. And then within that, you know, and then after that, I have, you know, maybe 16 or 17 versions of the book. So it's really just lots and lots of playing, but I don't set rules for it, except maybe, you know, that's where the writing comes in, having a sense of what the objectives are for the project, right? Like what do I hope to get across? Because at the end of the day, you know, I did say that with this quiet, you know, I love the idea that, you know, that there's enough room and for a project to breathe, and so that it can be interpreted in many different ways, or that everyone, I think it'd be pretty boring if everyone walked away from viewing you know, mine or anyone's work with, you know, one clear idea of what that work is, right? So you know, leaving room for enough interpretation within the work, but still feeling like I've made some things clear, you know, put some anchors there that get at the arc I'm interested in.
Okay, so you're going to have to answer faster now because we've got a lot more questions.
Sorry.
Swanee, no, it's all great. Swanee asks, Amani, so wonderful to learn more about your practice and how you bring your ideas, research, and images to the book form. Are there titles by other contemporary photographers who use use of narrative in their book works have influenced the organization and production values of your own photo books?
I mean, yeah, certainly. I mean, I wouldn't say I could name any specific person more than another, but I mean, I have a huge collection of books and I'm always looking at books and fascinated by books. So I don't know how to answer that other than to say, you know, a good place to.
Do you have a favorite book?
You know, that's one of those questions I felt like, you know, in
Yeah.
high school and college, I could answer like, do you have a favorite art musician or something? But I don't. I mean, the people who were really important and influential at the beginning, again, were the Magnum people, because that's when I was just starting. So those, you know, Cartier-Bresson, Alex Weber, highly influential just in my way of thinking about photography. But, you know, from there, my work has, you know, changed dramatically. In terms of contemporary artists, I love the way Wolfgang Tillmans plays with imagery, different kinds of imagery. Laia Abril, I think, is a really fascinating artist. Gosh, there's so many though, you know, it's just, I mean, that's the beauty also of, I think now, when I first got into photography in college, going to the library at Wesleyan, there was, you know, maybe 4 feet of books in the photography collection and that was it, right? And now, you know, we can see images forever online. And so, I mean, there's just such a huge well of influences. Yeah.
Marcy asks, congratulations, Amani. This was fantastic. How do you think about your work in relationship to documentary photography versus fictional magazine, imaginative narrative?
Oh, Marcy, tough question. um, well, I think it depends on the project. With Disquiet and Joseph Plummer, I think definitely felt like I had a lot more creative license to it, where um, it's really about creating an experience. And as I said, I feel like those images can be, untethered from the world and kind of become their own thing. And so the images are from the real world and they're about an experience of the world, but I don't see them as, I think we all talk about, images as and the truth value of images as being kind of suspect anyway, but not to go down that road right now. I think that what I'm not concerned with in those projects, but with how images are being read, or that you understand if an image is being, I guess, being displayed truthfully from my standpoint, right? I think I have a lot of leeway with those images. In the newer project, I felt more of a responsibility to have some sort of art, some sort of historical anchor, while still trying to convey the feeling. Yeah, I'm always just more interested in the feeling than, and I think that feeling it has truth in it, right? And it can be just as powerful as reading, some some dry history book. But, I want to convey that feeling more than just the documentation of something. But that's a really hard question, and it's something we can talk about for a lot longer.
All right, Claudia, this is the last question. Claudia asks, Amani, do you let other photo friends, mentors see your work and help you with sequencing and editing, or do you work alone? Thank you and love your work.
Well, thank you for your kind words. So I went to grad school, and one of the things I learned there was there's a lot of different opinions and there's a lot of voices out there, and you have to know what to trust in your heart, know how to take all advice, and maybe if you hear one thing a lot of times, that there might be something to it, and to look into it. But then you also have to find like-minded people whose opinions that you really trust and value, or you feel know your work really well and understand what it is that you're invested in trying to explore and trying to get across. So I would say, so when I was in grad school, a lot of people saw my work. After grad school, I did crit groups, and that is still valuable in some circumstances. But I tend to work alone for a long time and then show it to 2 or 3 trusted people at the most at this point. I have a really, really good relationship with my publisher, and we understand each other really well and work really well together. And so I know that they're going to do right by me. I know that I can trust her opinion, and so we have a good working relationship there. But no, I don't show it to too many people. I just find it can be really confusing. So yeah, but it is important to have a few trusted people for sure. You can't do. I mean, you read interviews with writers too, right? It's amazing how much having a good editor is so useful, and that writer can really transform what you wrote into something completely different than you thought it was going to be. And so I think it's kind of foolish to think, there's some people who can do it, but for me, I think it would be foolish to think I could do it all myself.
Great. Let's see. Uh-oh, we got one more question came in. Marcy asks, Amani, I was captivated with the installation of your recent show of Joseph Plummer at the Griffin. Where in the process do you think of presenting this work with so many diverse elements where in your process do you think of presenting this work with so many different elements in terms of an installation, which I don't think you were thinking of an installation when you made the book.
I wasn't specifically, but I was, as compared with Disquiet for that project, I was definitely thinking much more about the individual images and how they could live as images, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, but that's not I'm not thinking about that primarily at all. I mean, for me right now, you know, things could change. You know, we'll see where my creative path takes me. But I've been so preoccupied with the book and the book form, and just like really trying to think about how to use the book form in the ways that are really engaging and fun for me. And that hasn't run its course yet, but you know, I'm sure at some point I'll start thinking about images being on the wall primarily again.
Well, to finish, do you care to share anything about what you're working on next? Or you just published a book, so that's kind of, you may just want to take a break. But is there a subject you're interested in?
Yeah, the next project I've sort of started doing some preliminary work and research into is the idea of passing within the Black community. And my grandfather's brother left our family and passed for his life. And so I'm just, you know, interested in sort of diving into that more and sort of deconstructing these ideas.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. When you said passing, I thought you meant dying.
Sorry, no.
No. But yeah, oh, that's going to be really fascinating. So thank you, Amani. I hope, Jason, that you copy this chat, because Amani's getting a lot of wonderful sentiments in the chat, and thrilling to hear about your work and your process and see your beautiful images. And congratulations on all the successes that have come to you, so well deserved. And wishing you just an incredible, wondrous new year that's filled with creativity and family and good health.
Well, thank you. I was so happy to be here tonight. And again, you know, it's not lost on me that, you know, anytime you have an audience of anyone who wants to pay attention to your work, it's a blessing. So I appreciate you all being here. Appreciate being in a conversation with you, Aline, and just having you take an interest in my work. And I admire your work and what you do with photography so much. So this has been a really exciting experience for me as well, just to have the time to spend with you.
Well, thank you. And thank you, everyone. You know, please be safe, stay home, especially those in Los Angeles. We're at a critical point. No one needs to see each other. We all look better on Zoom anyway. So we all look younger on Zoom. And I'm sure, Amani, if you want to, I'm sure he would love to hear from you if you want to reach out to him. And
Oh, yeah, please feel free anytime. If you ever want to just talk about anything, I'm more than happy to do that.
Yeah. All right, Jason, anything left to say?
No, that's it. Yeah, the chat will be made available. It does get recorded along with the video and the whole thing. But other than that, on behalf of myself and Los Angeles Center of Photography, thank you all for being here, and stay safe out there and have a great night.